The Quad Alliance, made up of foreign ministers from Australia, the United States, India, and Japan, will convene a meeting in Japan on October 5th to October 7th, a move that has drawn the displeasure of the Chinese Communist Party. Australian Foreign Affairs Minister Marise Payne will fly to Tokyo to meet with counterparts U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Japanese Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi, and Indian Minister of External Affairs Subramanyam Jaishankar. They will discuss support for regional responses to the pandemic along with vaccines from the CCP, Chinese Communist Party virus, supply chains, and quality infrastructure investment. The CCP virus is commonly known as a novel coronavirus. On October 3rd, Payne said in a statement, "The Quad meeting comes at an important time in the Indo-Pacific, when our shared interests are under unprecedented pressure, including as the region responds to COVID-19. We are committed to working together, and with all countries in the region, to chart a road to recovery in a way that helps all countries reinforce their sovereignty and resilience." Toshimitsu Motegi, Japan's foreign minister, anticipates the meeting will receive a high degree of attention as it is the first to be held in Japan since the CCP virus pandemic. At a press conference on September 29th, Motegi said, "I believe it is truly timely to have the foreign ministers of the four countries meeting in Tokyo for an in-person exchange of views. We have similar views about responding to various issues that have come about due to the outbreak and spread of the novel coronavirus as well as regional situations." Motegi said he will seek to further deepen cooperation between the participating countries. He said, "The free and open Indo-Pacific vision is becoming increasingly important for the post-novel coronavirus world." He also aims to have bilateral meetings with each country's foreign ministers. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he was looking forward to visiting Tokyo for the meetings. On September 29th, he wrote on Twitter, "Anticipating productive meetings with my counterparts, as well as the Quad foreign ministers meeting with Australia, India, and Japan." Pompeo has been on a diplomatic tour through parts of Europe which included talking about religious freedom while in Rome and the risks of the Chinese Communist Party. While briefing the traveling press en route to Ireland on October 2nd, Pompeo admitted that pandemic had made diplomatic travel a little difficult and blamed the Chinese regime for unleashing a virus on the world. Pompeo said, "You are all standing here wearing masks because they decided that they were going to let people travel out of Wuhan when they knew, and they disappeared doctors."
The Chinese Communist Party has a long-standing custom of compiling internal references known as niezhan in Chinese for top officials. These publications vary by degree of confidentiality and are available to different levels of leaders from the party's upper echelons down to county-level governments. They are only allowed to be seen by party officials. This tradition can be traced back to 1948 when the CCP was about to come to power in mainland China. They serve as a secret source of news to keep officials informed of the latest major events at home and abroad, which would not be available to ordinary citizens due to Beijing's strict censorship rules. State-run media Xinhua is the sole provider of internal reference documents which contain a section on how the world views the Chinese regime. The Epoch Times recently acquired some of these documents which show that an overwhelming portion of the reports referenced information that portrays Beijing in a positive light, while negative news is deliberately overlooked. One section of the documents listed the latest global sanctions categorized by different targeted countries, firms and individuals. In the 12th issue for May the 6th to the 13th, 2020, the niezhan mentioned that Europe and the UK had imposed sanctions against 6 human rights abusers in Nicaragua. However, it did not include information about US President Donald Trump extending an executive order issued the year prior that barred US companies from working with or buying telecom equipment from companies deemed a threat to national security. The order was widely considered to be targeting Chinese telecom giant Huawei, which had been banned from the United States 5G rollout on security grounds. Another niezhan report summarized overseas public opinion on the CCP virus pandemic as reflected in foreign media. In the report, the severity of the pandemic in foreign countries was highlighted, but there was no mention of growing criticism from the international community about the Chinese regime's cover-up of the pandemic. The report made no mention of the FBI confirming that it was investigating China-linked cyber actors and monitoring their attempts to identify and illicitly obtain valuable intellectual property and public health data related to vaccines, treatments and testing from networks and personnel affiliated with COVID-19 related research. Another notable omission was a BBC interview with Chris Patten, the last British governor in Hong Kong, titled, "Is China Using Coronavirus to Bully the World?" Patten bashed the Chinese regime for exploiting the pandemic to flex its muscles and bully Taiwan and Hong Kong. His remarks drew widespread attention in international media. As expected, the internal documents remarked positively on authorities' domestic handling of the pandemic, mentioning school reopenings and measures to stimulate the domestic consumer market. The reports also made mention of economic reviews which spoke favourably of China's economy, the internal documents stated. They cited statements in foreign media explaining that India could not replace the role of China as the world's factory. Post-COVID-19 China was likely to lead the world into reopening, and China remained a popular destination for US corporate investment. The reports did mention some negative news. On May the 18th, a Financial Times report stated that nearly 500 listed companies in China suffered investment losses in the first quarter of 2020. Analysts cited in Financial Times said the companies spent too much effort on stock speculation while ignoring their core business. The Neisan documents also mentioned a paper that stated China's capital markets were likely to face the worst outflow in 4 years, and a report compiled by Goldman Sachs foreign exchange strategists that said tensions with the United States likely spurred the process of capital outflow.
China's Sichuan province recently encouraged catering businesses and citizens to store food for the upcoming months. Many people interpret it as a sign that China may have severe food shortage later this year. According to Chinese media Daily Economic News, Sichuan is both a major food producer and consumer. Considering the numerous natural disasters in recent years, food security has become a top priority, especially this year's agricultural activities were halted in spring due to the pandemic. It is therefore urgent to stabilize food production, ensure food security, and manage grain production and distribution by law, the report said. On September 27th, the Standing Committee of the Sichuan Province People's Congress was held in Chengdu to review the draft regulation on food security in Sichuan Province. The draft regulation covers multiple aspects such as grain production, grain storage, grain circulation, and emergency protection. It specifically added a clause to encourage catering companies, canteens, as well as urban and rural households to store a certain amount of food according to their needs.
What they consider is not whether the commoners will suffer starvation, but whether its regime is stable or not. Now that the government has implemented many measures, the original intentions and final results of its policies often turn out to be opposite. As their propaganda intensifies, it becomes more difficult for people to understand. Of course, they always try to deceive as many people as possible, and they are adjusting their policies accordingly.
Some locals believe that after the government encourages people to hoard food, the authorities will then collect it from residents and peasants in case of a severe shortage. In fact, the CCP's National Grain Reserve has already run into problems. Previously, a number of Chinese state media reported that in some grain reserve depots, the actual amount of rice in reserve was much less than the recorded rice purchases. In one of the food warehouses, more than 400 tons of grains were missing when compared to the actual amount in storage. Analysts believe that it was not an ordinary theft, but a well-designed state fraud.
In China, wherever there is power, there is corruption. In the grain depot system or the national grain storage system, the power lies in the authority to oversee these foods, and the foods can be exchanged for money. There are corrupted officials at every level of the food reserve system who are selling the national food reserve for personal profits, and they have certain methods to cover up their illegal transactions. Where is its power? In the end, the foods are secretly sold to the extent that some of the grain warehouses are completely empty.
There have been many alarming signs pointing to China's upcoming food crisis. In mid-September, when Chinese Vice Premier Hu Chunhua visited the Heilongjiang province, one of China's major agricultural bases, to inspect the production of grains, he instructed that locals must fight against natural disasters to ensure a good harvest in autumn. In July, Chinese authorities ordered all agricultural bases to give up non-essential crops and focus on grain production. Non-essential crops referred to orchards, fruits, and profitable crops such as cotton. CCP leader Xi Jinping also made the rare move to call on Chinese citizens to curb food consumption and stop food waste.
China's food crisis problem is like a sword hanging on one's head, which may fall at any time. Xi Jinping tried to come up with a way to solve this problem, and he called for people to stop food waste. However, he does not dare to discuss the problem explicitly. This is because when you openly discuss this problem, everyone would rush to hoard food. That's something the authorities try to avoid. It's just such a dilemma. This regime has entered a turbulent stage, and it is dying. Therefore, Chinese civilians should have enough food stocked up at home to make some preparations for themselves.
In the face of the people's various questions about food security, the Chinese authorities have repeatedly claimed that China had a bumper harvest this year with an increase in production.
This summer, 28 provinces in China were flooded, and half of China was soaked in water. But take a look at the recent news reports. They claim that farmers are harvesting autumn grains now, and the harvest will be a record high. Sheer nonsense. How could it be a record high when almost all agricultural bases were flooded? The news they produce is completely fake news.
Many believe that the CCP's grain output data this year is meant to deceive the Chinese people, and a food crisis will likely break out in the following 6 months.
Chinese technology companies have recently been hit with U.S. sanctions, creating a disruption crisis in the silicon chip supply chain. The Ministry of Education of the PRC recently issued a plan to speed up the training and recruiting of talents in an extra-conventional way to deal with the sanctions. On September 22nd, the Ministry of Education, the National Development and Reform Commission, and the Ministry of Finance jointly issued the Opinions on Accelerating the Reform and Development of Graduate Education in the New Era. The Ministry of Education introduced the so-called opinions at a press conference and stated that they will focus on core technologies in key areas and accelerate the training of a group of talents in short supply in an extraordinary way to solve the bottleneck problem and advance scientific and technological innovation. Chinese-Canadian writer Sheng Xue commented that the statement made by the Ministry of Education of the PRC is completely against science and common sense.
The CCP suddenly said that it would use super conventional methods to train scientists, which is very ridiculous. It just shows that the CCP has been using any means it can to scam, steal, forcibly take, and commit fraud in many fields of science and scientific research.
Xing Tianxing, a current affairs commentator in the United States, said that the CCP actually wants to return to the Mao Zedong era by concentrating a group of human and financial resources under unified management to do what it calls technological research, combining this great leap forward in education with the great leap forward in science and technology to deceive the people and create the illusion that they are not afraid of U.S. technology sanctions.
The CCP is in a state of being besieged and chased down, so it wants to pick up the method of the Maoist era, hoping to make technological breakthroughs through the Great Leap Forward. Whether it can actually reach that result is another matter. But on the surface, it must create momentum and do something, to give the Chinese people hope and the appearance that the CCP is able to break through all kinds of difficulties.
The opinions of the Chinese Ministry of Education also claimed that graduate education should be guided by Xi Jinping's thoughts on socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era, and that strengthening ideological and political education should be listed as the first key reform. Sheng Xue said that under the CCP's rule, everything must serve political needs, so real research in science, literature, philosophy, and technology cannot be conducted. The education policy in the opinions cannot cultivate real talents, because an authoritarian regime can only kill talents.
China is a big country with a population of 1.4 billion, but it has never had any outstanding talents in most fields of science, technology, or culture. And this is precisely because of the CCP's tyranny. It does not allow people to be innovative, thoughtful, and to truly research and invent things from an unbiased, scientific point of view.
The Ministry of Education of the Chinese Communist Party specifically pointed out that the authors of the opinions also include the Ministry of Finance. Xing Tianxing believes that the Ministry of Finance will invest a large amount of funds under the CCP's requirement of fast training of core technical talents in the Great Leap in Education, which provides a hotbed of corruption for CCP officials.
The management level of the CCP are all corrupt criminals. So when they set up projects in such an unusual way, you can imagine that it will produce a group of corrupt officials in the process. Their unusual and unconventional processes of supposedly cultivating talent is just a way for them to engage in corruption.
On September 15th, the U.S. ban on Huawei took effect. Since then, all chip manufacturers that use American-designed equipment or rely on American software and technology have stopped supplying Huawei. The major official media of the Chinese Communist Party have admitted that they have been stuck and therefore proposed to increase research funding and find ways to make high-end chips to avoid being controlled by others. However, Xie Tian, a chair professor at the Icahn School of Business at the University of South Carolina in the United States, said that although the CCP has the money to build hardware facilities, real academic exchanges and technological innovation cannot be achieved without a free, equal, and open environment. The CCP now uses this so-called super-conventional Great Leap Forward type of way to promote rapid technological innovation. The result will just be a waste of huge amounts of money without any real innovations.